This is an overview of the workshop that I did at the MPRES grant. So I just thought I would walk you through this way you can kind of remind yourself of some of the things that we talked about. So I started off talking a little bit about modeling, and then I asked each group to choose a model, something like a plant cell, the atom, or something related to plate tectonics, or perhaps a solar system, or even come up with your own and just talk about that model a little bit in terms of the effectiveness in the classroom, how you use it, success you've had, things like that. Then I focused on these questions right here, asking you as a group to really dial in about each of these questions. So you spend some time doing that. Then after, again, related to the model that you had chosen. And then we came back as a full group and you debriefed that discussion. Then I led you into another activity. I had a flask that had ammonia in it. Just walked around the classroom and let that material sort of diffuse throughout the air in the room. And I asked you to draw a picture of what you thought was going on there. Then I told you we would revisit that. Then I gave you a syringe and I asked you to begin to explore a little bit with that syringe, and you found out that when you put your finger over the top of the syringe and tried to push the plunger in, that it only went so far. And then if you put your finger over the end of the opening and pulled the plunger out, it would only get so far. Each time that you did that and let go of the cylinder, it would return to that original spot. So I asked you to think a little bit about the phenomenon that you had witnessed, the fact that it can only go so far in, it can only pull so far out. And then I asked you to concentrate on one air particle in each of these scenarios right here, and I asked you to draw what you thought that would look like. It was interesting that even though I directed you to take a look at a single air particle, many of you started to take a look at the relationship between the particles, and so you had a hard time dealing with just one particle. But we talked a lot about how when you really focused on the one particle, it caused you to think a little bit more deeply. Then I had you come up front and share what you had just talked about with each of those particles. Then, in the midst of all that, I asked you to create a model that would explain what was going on in each of those phenomena that you were seeing. So create a model that would explain why when I push the plunger in, it only goes so far. When I let go of the plunger, it comes back out. When I pulled the cylinder on the syringe out this way, and let go, it would always go back to that. And so many of you drew some sort of a picture, and then I went around the room with my iPad and I took pictures of the models that you had created, and then I would have you guys come up front and then put your picture up on the screen. Everyone could see that, and then I had you argue for your model. So with that, you talked about what compression means, you talked about what expansion means, and you argued from the evidence in your model. One of the things I really encouraged was that scientific discourse, so that we would then challenge you with questions that we weren't fully comfortable with in terms of the explanation that you were giving. So we were trying to get you to think more deeply and to give us more reasons to buy your model or to accept your model as a way to explain both compression and expansion. So with that activity, we actually ended up doing two of the science and engineering practices. One of those was creating models, and the second one was then arguing from evidence. And we spent a little bit of time talking about that arguing piece and how it's not a negative connotation to argue from evidence. We're really just presenting the information from the evidence. Then we revisited the flask of ammonia, and what's interesting is most people, when they first draw that diagram of what's going on, they tend to show a little fluffy cloud. That somehow whatever's inside of there is coming out as a fluffy little cloud. But as we understand more and as we think more deeply about what's going on with those individual air particles, we understand that it's not this fluffy cloud thing that's going on, but instead it's that interaction between those molecules that is causing the odor to come out of the flask and then be disseminated around the room. Then I shared this with you, and it was a group of students who were also dealing with a model. And what these guys were doing was they were taking a look at trying to identify rocks and minerals. So they're starting with minerals that make up igneous rocks, and they're trying to create a model of how to explain that. Let's see if I can get this to work.
So we lined up these rocks in order from the brightest to the darkest. These are the minerals, starting with quartz, ending with olivine. We took igneous rocks and lined them up beside these minerals from the color brightness to dark. This one goes here because it's in that range, and then we're using that to help us figure out which of these minerals are in these igneous rocks.
Nice. Good job. Thank you.
So that's a group of students I'm working with. They're middle school and high school kids, and that was their first day at trying to create this model. So that was one variable that they started to look at, was the color, and I'm encouraging them to continue to take a look at other variables like texture, grain size, things like that, but they're generating those ideas on their own. So when they come away from this activity, they will have created their own model to explain how we get from minerals to igneous rocks. And then I won't play this for you, but just remember that Paul Anderson has his information about the science and engineering practices, and those are at the website called bozemanscience.org. Then we took a look at exploring pendulums, because what I wanted to do with this science and engineering practice is highlight analyzing and interpreting data. So we had a simple pendulum setup. We had something, an arm of some kind to support the top of a pendulum, that fulcrum point. We had a long string, a piece of a paper clip tied at the bottom, some washers at the bottom, so that you can manipulate the length of the string, you can manipulate the mass that's on the bob itself, and then I asked you to begin to take a look at what actually affects the length of a pendulum, or excuse me, what affects the swing of a pendulum. So is it the length? Is it the mass? Is it how far back you pull it? Are there other variables that will affect how fast or slow a pendulum swings? At some point we needed to also talk about some common language around pendulums. So we talked about frequency and period, cycles and hertz. But the primary focus here was to get you to determine what are the variables that will affect the swinging time of a period. Then I encouraged you to create some investigations to explore those, and I encourage you to create data tables so that you now have a set of data that you can use to support your claim in terms of which variables are going to affect the swinging period or the cycles of a pendulum. Then I had you create those data tables, take a look at those, so you're analyzing that data, you're interpreting that data, and then just like I did with the modeling, I could go around with my iPad or a phone, I could take photos of your data tables, I could project those on the screen, and then I could have you come up and then do your argumentation for whatever claim you're making based on your data. So it's similar to the models, but instead of just having something drawn, now we're using data to interpret and analyze to help us make our claims. So that's a way then to get to that argumentation spot. Then we debriefed that, gave you an opportunity to share your results. Again, that scientific discourse needs to take place, so we're challenging some of the claims that you're making. We're having you, if we see an error in your data that you're presenting to us, we can challenge you on that. And again, it's not confrontational. It does not have a negative connotation to it. We are all in this learning process together. Then I shared with you this, and I'll do this real quickly. It's a real-life example of where we use science and engineering practices. Some people can't relate to this at all because you don't backcountry ski, you don't really care about snow conditions in avalanche country, but some people will understand this. But it's a really good, clear-cut way to make those connections between science and engineering practices and real life.
I'm here in the Bridger Range. I'm north of Bridger Bowl in what we call the Flatirons, the throne area. Eric and I were skinning up here, checking out conditions, and immediately we noticed that the snow is slightly upside down. We're the storm moving in today is slightly heavier, and we're seeing instabilities breaking within the storm snow. As we were skinning up here, it started to feel a little worse and worse. We got more nervous, and so we stopped and we dug about 15 feet above us here, and we weren't getting anything in our stability tests. And so we moved just downhill a little bit to where it was slightly slabbier, and sure enough, we got ECT column to break clean across within the storm snow. And what that tells us is it's telling us that the instability is getting worse, that we'll probably see natural activity once this storm breaks. And the closer we get to the ridge, the more wind loading there's going to be, the greater instability there is, the more dangerous it is. So we're actually heading back to the snowmobiles in the car.
Well, that's a really good example of how you can use science and engineering practices in real life. So when skiers and snowmobilers and snowboarders go into the backcountry, they need to be able to assess the conditions to make sure it's safe to ride and ski on the snow that they're choosing to play on. So one of the ways that they do that is they actually conduct a test. And that's what Doug was doing right there in that video. And then based on the evidence you get from the test, you make a decision. What's really interesting is that we still have a human component to every decision that's ever made. Even though we have all the evidence in front of us, it's still possible to ignore the evidence and just go with a belief, for example, or a desire. You know, I don't know how many times avalanches occur and people die when you hear the story after the fact. Somebody says, well, we knew it probably wasn't the safest place, but we wanted to ski it anyway. So it's a great way to help students understand that even though we have all the evidence we need, sometimes decisions are based merely on what we feel or what we think and not on the evidence itself. So it's a great conversation to have with kids. Finally, I'd just like to remind you that as we're dealing with all of the dimensions, whether it's the cross-cutting pieces or the practices or the content, we need to remember that all three of those fit together. So we don't want to just be teaching practices all by themselves. We always want to connect those to the other two pieces. The same thing with the cross-cutting concepts and the same thing with the content. So whenever we think about putting a science lesson together, we need to think in terms of all three of those dimensions to make sure that we are covering what needs to be done. So I hope that was helpful, and let me know if you have questions about any of that. Thanks.